Everyone, good morning. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Susan. I'm the manager of the international office here at OCAD. And I'd like to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Elizabeth Long and Zia Sumar, who are immigration lawyers at Long Mung Galji LLP here in Toronto. They're going to talk to you today about working as a student and after graduation, and also pathways to permanent residence. The session is being recorded, so you'll get the link to the recording once it's ready. So anyway, yeah, I'll pass things over to Elizabeth to get started.
Okay, thank you so much, Susan. It's so great to be here. Before we get started, just wanted to let you guys know that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the bottom there at the Q&A button there. And we will try to answer your questions at the end, okay? All right, let's get started. Okay, so today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be speaking to you guys about your immigration options with regard to getting permanent residence. But before we get to permanent residence, we need to talk about your temporary residence and what you need to do right now to make sure that you can maintain your temporary residence and you can work legally and study legally as well.
So the first thing, of course, is that while you're here in Canada, you want to make sure that you always do have temporary residence. So what that means is that for those of you, who are studying, will have a study permit. On that study permit, there's an expiry date. Really important that before your permit expires, that you submit an extension application if you're continuing to study in Canada, so that you keep your status and you keep your authorization, which allows you to be studying here. Now, as long as you submit your extension application properly before the expiry date of your current study permit, you'll have what's called implied or maintained status. What this means is that you can continue studying in Canada while you're waiting for a decision on that extension application, as long as you remain here. This allows you to make sure that there's no break in between your studies. Now, IRCC's website will say on there that you should be submitting your extension applications 30 days before the expiry of your current permit. While that's great, that's not actually the law. The law is that it has to be submitted prior to the expiry date. So as long as you submit it before your permit expires, you will hold the implied or maintained status. Very importantly, though, you do only get implied status if you apply properly. So what that means is submitting a complete application, submitting it properly. If you don't, so let's say, for example, you forget to pay the application fees, that would mean that's as if you have not applied for your extension, right? So let's say you realize, you wake up, you've realized that you've missed the deadline on your study permit. What happens is that now you've lost your status. And there is a period for you to get your status back. This is called a restoration application now. So for someone who has lost status, you do have a period of 90 days to submit a restoration application to get your status back. Really important, though, that you don't miss that window. There is no extension after those 90 days, so really important to make sure you're submitting your restoration application before that 90-day period ends.
So Zia, just to clarify, let's say I had applied for my study permit extension. Let's say my study permit expires on February 28th, and I applied to extend my status on February 27th. Does that mean I can continue to stay in Canada until I don't get a decision until May 1st, let's say?
Correct. Yeah. So you can continue to remain in Canada. You can continue to study because you've submitted your application before the expiry date that's listed on your study permit.
Okay. And that's if I actually paid the right fees. If I didn't pay the right fees.
Yeah. So assuming you've paid the right fees, you've applied properly, you've provided a complete application, then yes, you can continue to study.
Okay, but then what if I just realized, oh shoot, I submitted the wrong passport. It was my old passport, and the officer rejected my application on May 1st. So then I have 90 days, but when does the 90 days start? Does it start on May 1st or does it start on February 28th when my original study permit expired?
So because your application was rejected, it's as if you had not applied, and so it would start
was
from.
No, it was rejected. So
it was rejected. Sorry.
Yeah.
So then your 90 days starts from May 1st.
So basically I had status until May 1st, and then the 90 days start May 1st. But if I didn't pay the right fees and it was returned, then it started February 20th.
On February 27th, yeah. February 28th, when your permit expires. Yes, exactly.
Perfect. Okay, great. All right. Now, the second thing I want to talk to you guys about is the difference between high-skilled work and low-skilled work. This is super important because immigration right now for permanent residents, when we talk about permanent residents, you'll see that they make a big distinction between work that they deem is high-skilled and work that they deem is low-skilled. It's the high-skilled work for the most part that will help you get to permanent residence compared to the low-skilled. So there's a brand new system that started in November of last year to classify high-skilled versus low-skilled. It's still called the NOC codes, the NOC codes. But before, the NOC codes were classified in 5 different classifications, 0, A, B, O, A, B, C, and D. Now it's gone to 6 classifications, and they're called tiers. So with the tiers, tier 0, 1, 2, and 3 are high skilled. Tier 4 and 5 are low skilled. Okay. And from the old system to the new system, there are a lot of occupations that were previously classified as low skilled that are now high skilled. For example, tattoo artists, dental assistants, truck drivers, etc. But there are also some occupations that were previously classified as high skilled that are now low skilled. For example, tailors and dressmakers, and what they call other performers like buskers and things like that. So it's very important that, number one, you don't just assume whether or not something is high skilled or low skilled. Okay. You go into the system. I've included a link here that it's a table that looks at previous occupations under the old classification code compared to the new classifications. And also, don't rely on your friends. Don't think that, oh, my friend got through, or my friend couldn't get through, last year. In the same situation, I can't do it as well, because the system has changed as well. Okay.
Okay, let's talk about working and studying on your study permit here. So on the study permit itself, there are some conditions that are expressly written on there that are very clear, right? So for example, the expiry date that we just talked about. There are other conditions on the study permit that are assumed that okay, that they're implied. One of those is that you must be actively pursuing your studies. So what that means is that while you're here in Canada on your study permit, IRCC expects that you're always making progress towards the completion of your program. If for whatever reason you stop studying, right? Let's say you decide you don't like the course anymore, you don't want to study, for whatever reason it is that you stop studying, even if your study permit itself is valid for another 2 years, it actually becomes invalid 90 days from when you stop studying. Okay, so if I have a study permit that's valid until 2025, for example, but on March 1st, I decide I'm no longer going to study anymore, 90 days from March 1st, I will no longer have a valid study permit because I am no longer actively pursuing studies. So really important while you're here in Canada that you are always moving towards the completion of your program. Now, there are two exceptions to that rule. The first is if you're on a scheduled break. Now, when we talk about scheduled breaks, IRCC defers to your institution, so your school, and the academic calendar for your program. So there's not one set schedule that IRCC uses for all international students. Instead, they go back and say, okay, you have to look at your academic calendar for your school, for your program, and that's what will determine what is a regularly scheduled break and what isn't. So what we mean by that is looking at your program and saying, okay, when does your program actually go on break? So for example, if we're doing a 4-year bachelor's program, normally you'll have 2 semesters of school and 1 summer semester. That summer semester would be considered a scheduled break. There are other programs, let's say, for example, a master's program that's 18 months long, they may not have any scheduled breaks, right? And so if a student decides, okay, well, you know what, yeah, my program is supposed to be 18 months straight, but I need a semester off. I want to take the summer off like other students that I see that are not in my program. I can't go and create my own summer break and then say that that's a regularly scheduled break. Okay, so IRCC defers to the academic calendar for your program at your school. The second exception is if you're on an authorized leave. So an authorized leave is one that's actually, there's circumstances where you may need to take some time off, and that's fine. So for example, if you need a medical leave, if there's a family situation and you need some time off, but it has to, you have to let the school know, and the school has to actually approve that leave. It's best to have that in writing, because later on when you're applying for your postgrad work permit or study permit extension, you will need to prove that you were actually on an authorized leave. But those are the two exceptions. So you do need to be actively pursuing your studies. The only exceptions to it is if you're on a scheduled break or you have an authorized leave from your school. Now, study permits give us the ability to work, right? Which is awesome, great benefit. While you're here in Canada, your study permit does allow you to work using that study permit, so without needing a separate work permit, as long as you are a full-time student. Okay, so very importantly, in order to be able to use your study permit to work, you have to be a full-time student. When we talk about full-time, again, we're deferring back to the school. We're talking about what the school defines as full-time. The only exception to the requirement to be a full-time student is if you're in your final semester of your program and you do not need a full-time course load in order to finish your program. Okay, that's the only exception to the rule of needing to be a full-time student. Now, what that means is that as soon as you are no longer a full-time student, as soon as you've completed your program, you have to stop working. So let's go through an example here. So what we mean by this is that while you're studying, it's clear you're a full-time student. When you're in your final semester, you've done your final exams, at that point, you're still considered a full-time student. It's as soon as you receive any written confirmation from the school that you have met the criteria of your program in order to graduate, it's at that point that you're no longer a student. So this could mean your final grades being posted. It can mean receiving a letter from the school or an email from the school that tells you that you've completed your program. Anything that indicates to you that you have now completed that program of study, that also means that you are no longer a full-time student and you do have to stop working. You can't use your study permit to work anymore. Okay, so let's go through an example. So someone who's in their final semester, they're doing their final exams, at that point, still a student. Okay, they're waiting for their marks to be posted, still a student, still can work. As soon as there's the final grades being released, or like I said, a letter from the school, that's what triggers the fact that you're no longer a student and you have to stop working using your study permit. Okay. Elizabeth will talk about in a moment applying for the postgrad work permit and being able, and when you can start working again full-time, but I'll leave that for when Elizabeth talks about it. I also want to talk about how much you can work. right? So how many hours? So last year in October, or sorry, from November, the announcement was in October, but it started in November. Anyone who has a study permit that they applied for before October 7th is able to work full-time right now up until the end of this year. But it's really important, you have to actually hold a study permit that you either applied for or that you had on October 7th. If you on October 7th, you had a study permit, but that study permit expired on February 10th of this year. What that meant is you could work full-time up until February 10th, even if you submitted your extension application properly. That ability to work full-time ended on February 10th. Okay, so the temporary policy that IRCC released to allow students to work full-time, it's very limited in the sense that it's only applicable to those who had study permits on October 7th, and it's particular to the study permit that you held on that particular date. So a little bit confusing, because I know this comes up a lot as when can I work, when can I not work, or how much can I work? And so it's really important to understand that distinction.
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Zia, we have some questions about self-employed work as well. And so basically, if you are self-employed, it depends on the kind of work that you do, basically, as to whether or not it's counted towards hours or not. If you are, doing work where you're entering into the labor market, then you would be like, if you're being hired as an employee or as a contractor, if you're self-employed, then that's certainly, counted as work hours. If your employer is in Canada, if you're doing work for someone outside of Canada, then that's not counted as work in Canada that you're restricted to. So it can be, especially for self-employed work, it can be a little bit tricky. So, be sure to speak with a lawyer to understand whether or not that is considered to be work where you're restricted by hours as well.
Yeah, that definitely adds a whole other layer to working.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the other thing I do want to note before we start talking about the postgrad work permit is that if you finished one program, you're moving on to a second program, you can work full-time between your programs as long as that period is less than 150 days and you still hold your study permit or you've applied for your extension and you've already been accepted into that second program. The last thing is that if you're on an authorized leave, you can't work, right? So if you take time off for whatever reason it is, that period that you're on an authorized leave, that study permit that you hold does not allow you to work at all in Canada.
Okay, so let's talk about the postgrad work permit. The postgrad work permit, I like to think of it as a golden ticket. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you only get one golden ticket in your lifetime. Okay, and this postgrad work permit, I would say it's better than that Charlie and the Chocolate Factory golden ticket. Yeah, you don't get to eat unlimited chocolate, but you get to work unlimited with regard to where you can work in Canada and who you can work for, which is very it's a rare opportunity in Canada. Okay, and because you only have one in your lifetime, you really have to make sure that from a whole plan perspective, you are able to do what you need to do on that postgrad work permit. Because once your postgrad work permit ends, trying to get another work permit could be impossible for you. Okay, so it's very important to get proper advice before you even apply for the postgrad work permit, because The length of the postgrad work permit depends on how long the program that you attended was for. So if it was under 2 years, so let's say you did a 1-year program, you only get a 1-year work permit. That may or may not be enough for you to get the work experience or the job offer that you need to get permanent residence. Okay, some people it's okay, other people it may not be enough. Now, if you did a 1-year program and then you did another 1-year program afterwards, you can get a 3-year work permit. Okay, 1 + 1 = 3 in this situation. As long as you did not before already apply for a postgrad work permit. Okay. Another very important thing is right now we're going back to the pre-COVID rules where distance education is supposed to be less than 50% of your program. There are some exceptions to programs that started, in the last while. It's pretty convoluted. I won't go into all of the details, but from this point on, you should really think about making sure that distance education is less online, is less than 50% of your program. Okay. The other thing is you need to have maintained full-time status in school for every semester of your program except the last semester. Okay. This is really, really important, guys. I cannot stress this enough. It's really heartbreaking sometimes. I have students who come to me, they didn't know this rule, and they did part-time, in one of the semesters of the program, and they can't get a postgrad work permit at the end. Okay. If you are not able to do a full-time program, you may want to take off the semester and get authorized leave, right, from the school. But you have to ask the school first if you can get authorized leave before you can just take off authorized leave and say, okay, that's authorized leave. You have to be authorized by the school. Okay. So please make sure that you maintain full-time student status. Listen, even if you're going to fail a course, go and try and do the course and do the exam. If you fail the course at the end, but you've gone to classes, you did the exam, that's okay. You still were a full-time student, right? Even if you don't get all the credits. But if you drop out, halfway during the semester because you think you're going to fail, then that's not okay. Because if you don't show that you actually did that course for that semester, then that could disqualify you from getting a postgrad work permit at the end, and you may have to do another study permit afterward, a study program afterwards. Okay, so let's talk about when you can work. Okay, so Zia, help me with this. Okay, you give me the scenarios and let's do it again. It's super important, and we can, I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but it messes up a lot of students. It's very complicated. So I just wanted to make sure you guys understand. Okay, so Zia, let's run through this time.
I'm in my final semester. I'm doing a full-time course load. Can I work?
You can. Well, you're still, I haven't until, you haven't even done your exams yet. Is that what you're saying?
I haven't done my exams.
Okay.
It's still mid-January.
You can work. Yes. And if you have your study permit before October 7th and you're still on that study permit, you can even work full-time.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'm just finishing up my last exam. Can I still work this evening?
Yes, you can, because until you have your grades, you are still registered as a full-time student.
Okay. So I know my grades were released this morning, but I don't want to check them today. Can I still work?
No, willful blindness is not an excuse. Okay, so if it's the first indication that you have completed your program, if your grades are released and they show that you have completed your program, that day you have to stop working.
Okay. And what happens if I apply for my postgrad work permit the same day that my grades are released?
So if you apply for your postgrad work permit, as soon as you apply for your postgrad work permit, you can start working full-time. Okay, it's just in between that period from when you finish your studies, when you're no longer a full-time student, when you get the indication from the school that you completed your program, to when you apply for your postgrad work permit, that you cannot work at all, full-time, part-time, no time. Okay, you can't work at all. Okay. Now, let's talk about when you need to apply for your postgrad work permit. The IRCC website says 180 days, but I'm telling you, don't think about that date. Think about this date that I'm telling you, okay? It should be 90 days after you first get the indication that you've completed your program from the school, or if your study permit expires earlier than that, then it's your study permit. So your study permit expiry date or 90 days, whichever comes first, whichever comes earlier, okay? If you wait after 90 days to apply, your student status will be over and you have to file a restoration of status, and you cannot work past the while you're waiting for your work permit if you are applying after the 90 days. If you apply before 90 days and while your study permit is still valid, then you are allowed to work. Okay, so make sure your study permit is valid, right? Check your study. If your study permit expires before you're going to get the completion letter from your school, go and file an extension for your study permit right away so that you can get your, normally they're supposed to give you a study permit of 90 days after your study period ends to allow you to have some time to apply for your postgrad work permit. Okay, and apply for it right now so that you can start working. If you have a valid study permit and you apply for your postgrad work permit, you can start working while waiting for the work permits, because the work permits right now take 5 to 6 months, right? And so you want to make sure that you can work while waiting for your work permit.
Elizabeth, what if I'm on implied or maintained status on the day that I submit my postgrad work permit application? Can I work?
If you don't have your study permit in hand, then you cannot work.
So if I'm waiting for a decision on my extension application on the day that I apply for my postgrad work permit, I can't work.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't have a study permit in hand. Okay, so get your study permit.
So there's a question here about working. And so someone's asking, if they're on, let's say they hold a contract right now, the contract is from January of this year till September, right? They have a great job, to contract from January to September. What happens when they are in that interim period between they've received their final, like they've received that completion letter and it takes them, let's say, a week to apply for their postgrad work permit? What happens in that time?
You shouldn't be working. If you did, you would be working illegally. And on your form, you would have to indicate that you were working without status. And when you apply for work permit, the officer is prevented from giving you a work permit if you were working without authorization within 6 months. So it's not a good deal to do that. What I would suggest that you do is get your postgrad work permit application ready. You can apply online. Sometimes we might even have people apply at the border, at the port of entry, to get their work permit if they need their work permit right away. If you're in a situation, come for a consultation. We can advise you on what you can do. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. Enough about temporary residence. Let's move on to permanent residence. So the first system I'm going to talk about is express entry. This is the most popular system, but it's also there's a lot of misunderstandings about how the system works. So let me go through it. First of all, to get into the express entry, you first have to start an online profile. And you can create an online profile if you qualify under one of 3 categories. federal skilled worker class, Canadian experience class, or the federal skilled trades class. Once you qualify, you can enter the express entry pool. Now, make no mistake, when you enter express entry pool, you have not applied for permanent residence, okay? When you enter the express entry pool, you're just a candidate. You have said that you're interested in applying and you qualify, but you don't get to apply until, and sorry, when you get into the pool, you'll get a series of points that's based on your background, okay? And if you have provincial nomination. And every couple weeks or so, usually, but not always, okay? Every couple weeks or so, the government has a draw, and they usually base that draw on your CRS points, but they could base it on other things like which category did you go in. And starting later this year, the government has put into play legislation that says that they can select on other things like occupations or anything else that they feel like it, okay? So that's to come. But right now, most of the time, it's based on your numbers, your score, okay? Why does, like, you know, this points, there's been a lot of news about how this score has basically jumped really high in 2022. Why did that jump? It's because you know, they kind of describe express entry as skimming the cream, right? The cream goes up to the top. You're trying to get the top layers. And so what happened is in 2021, the government just made a mistake. They invited way too many people. And in October of last year, they realized, uh-oh, we invited too many people. We filled up all of our inventory for 2022 already in October of 2021. And so they said, okay, well, in that case, we have to stop inviting people. And they stopped inviting everyone except people who had provincial nominations from October to July. They started, so basically around 8 months, they stopped inviting anyone to apply. And because they stopped inviting two people to apply, the cream got thicker. There were more and more people in the pool. And so when they started inviting, and every time they might invite, let's say 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people, well, they had to, the points were very high because there were a lot of people at that high level. But the points have gradually started to come down lower. Pre-COVID, the points were at the 470s or so. And I would anticipate if they keep on inviting people, you know, the same, that it probably would drop to around that level. However, then there's another thing that's going to come up, which is occupations-based draws is what they said that they wanted to do. It's not in place yet, but probably will be later next year. And who knows what else, maybe international students, that would be great for you guys. Or maybe, you never know, but you know, job offers, etc. But you never know, but whatever it is, it's still, the points will still matter as well, okay? So just quickly, I wanted to talk about how to even get into the pool, okay? So to get into the pool, you could qualify under the federal skilled worker class. Now, this class is something that maybe a lot of you already might qualify for, even if you haven't worked in Canada. You can, I have a lot of people who've never come to Canada and they have gotten their permanent residence through this category. To qualify for this category, you need to have 1 year of high skilled work experience in one occupation that you have worked in continuously for 1 year, okay? And it's full-time, at least 30, on an average of 30 hours a week, so 1,560 hours altogether. Now, the work experience for this one can be self-employed work, It can be work while you're studying, and it doesn't have to be in Canada. Okay. After that, they look at your language points. Your points have to reach a certain level in language, but this language, it's not as important as it will be later on when they look at your CRS points to get out of the pool. And we also, also have to have a certain amount of financial savings as well. And we look at, there's a minimum score looking at the rest of your background that you have to meet in order to qualify. Okay. Now there's a second category called the Canadian Experience class. Now the work experience, to qualify for this, you need to have 1 year of high-skilled work experience where you are employed as an employee in Canada by a Canadian, by a business in Canada, and it has to be high-skilled. Okay. It does not have to be continuous. It does not have to be in the same occupation. It does not have to be related to your studies. It just has to be high-skilled. We talked about what high-skilled was, tiers 0, 1, 2, and 3. Okay. You have to pass a certain level in language, but again, just to pass, to get in, that's nothing compared to how much you need to get out. Okay, but this work experience, very importantly, is you cannot use self-employment work in Canada. It cannot be while you are a full-time student either. Okay, it has to be legal work experience. So most of the time it would be after you finished your studies, then you can go and get this work experience for the Canadian Experience class. Or if you have a spouse and they have an open work permit, they can also get that work experience as well. Okay. But it has to be employed, high-skilled work experience and your hours have to be 1,560 hours, 30 hours a week. Okay. There's the skilled trades. I'm not going to go into it. There's not a lot of people who qualify, and it's for people in the construction trades and cooks and chefs as well.
So
Okay.
Elizabeth, sorry,
Yeah.
before you talk about the CRS system, if I am doing self-employed work, right? If I'm here, I've opened my own business, how can I use that to apply for permanent residence?
Well, you could qualify under the federal skilled worker class, the work experience there. But self-employed work, it's going to be difficult when we look at the points, because self-employed work also doesn't count as work experience for points for express entry as well. So oftentimes we may be looking at different categories for those people who are self-employed, such as the self-employed artists category, which is completely separate from the express entry, but we'll get into that in a bit.
And I guess I would still be looking at that same program, the federal skilled worker, if I was working while I'm a student.
So yes, if you wanted to use your work experience to get into the pool, we could use work experience that you have when you're a student, or if you had work experience outside of Canada, we could use all that work experience. Now, the thing is that we're going to talk about points, because just because you can get into the pool, it doesn't mean that you can get out of the pool. And it's all about getting out of the pool as well. After you're in the pool for 1 year, your profile expires. So there's no point in just being able to get into the pool if you won't get an invitation to apply.
And so if I'm working right now using the temporary policy, which allows me to work full-time, that full-time work still doesn't count for Canadian experience, like for eligibility in Canadian experience.
Exactly.
It would only allow me to apply in federal skilled worker.
Yeah. I mean, I would say you may or may not, work experience may or may not be relevant, especially with regard to express entry, but it could be relevant for other programs. So don't just think, oh, this is the end all and be all. Express entry is not the end all and be all. We're going to talk about, it's the most popular one. It's the one that most people have heard about, but there are a lot of other programs that you can consider as well. Okay. Okay, just quickly going through, how do you get the points for express entry? The first thing is age. Once you get to your 30s, your points start dropping every time it's your birthday. Okay, so in your 30s, it's -5, -6. In your 40s, a fast slide, -10, -11 points, until you get to your 45th birthday. Then the good news is it doesn't go down anymore. Okay, but the bad news is it doesn't go down because you have a 0 in your age. Compared to someone in their 20s who has 110 points, that is a significant difference. Not a lot you can do about age except apply earlier when you can. And also, if it's a factor, we can also look at other scenarios as well, other programs as well. Education is important. If you have a bachelor's degree or another 3-year program, at least at a college, and you have another program, post-secondary program on top, that really gives you a boost with regard to education. Language here is very important. If you don't have work experience in Canada, to get an invitation to apply, you're really looking at a very high language exam results. For IELTS, for example, you're looking at 7s in reading, writing, and speaking, 8 in listening, or CELP if it's a 9. So we're looking at what's called a CLB 9 to even have a chance to be invited. Relevant Canadian work experience. So this is what Zia was talking about, okay? So in order to get the work experience that gives you points in Canada for the CRS points, you have to be employed. You can use self-employed work. And you have to have gained this work experience when you are not a full-time student, okay? So this work experience is something that normally you would gain after you graduate from school. Foreign work experience, if you have high-skilled work experience outside of Canada, this could also be quite valuable. Your spouse, if they have, very high education, language, and some Canadian work experience, those points could add to your application. But the main person is the principal applicant. That's where almost, like I would say, around 90% of the points are coming from. Provincial nominee programs. This is something that we're going to talk about in a bit, but this is something where it's not every provincial nominee program will give you 600 points. It has to be an express entry linked provincial nominee program that will give you 600 points, okay? Provincial nominee programs are programs where the provincial governments, they have the power to select people that they want to get permanent residence. And so it's, even though the federal government is responsible for immigration for the most part, they have also created agreements with each province to allow each province to select certain people who they want to get permanent residence as well. If you studied in Canada, especially if you studied at OCAD, you can get 30 points when you graduate, which is significant. And arranged employment. This is, people think, oh, I have a job offer, I have arranged employment. No, this is not the case. You won't get arranged employment if you have the post-grad work permit. You have to have an LMIA or a employer-specific work permit that will give you the arranged employment points. If you have brothers or sisters who are Canadians or permanent residents in Canada, that will give you some points. Fluency in French can also be very significant. And then trade certification, that's for people in the construction trades for the most part. Okay, so taking a look at the system, some of you may be thinking, okay, I'm doing pretty well. I think I'm going to score really high. Other people may not, be feeling too good. Sometimes even if you think you might do well, make sure you have a proper consultation, because even though you think, oh, I'm young, I have my degree from OCAD. If you don't have 2 programs, or maybe your language you think you're really good at language, but you do the language exam and you don't score it. Maybe you're just down by like, instead of a 7 for writing, you're down by 6.5. That can cut off your chances sometimes, you know? So yes, make sure that you get a proper evaluation of your situation, and not just rely on thinking, oh, I'm pretty good at this. Okay. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that provincial nominee program in Ontario that will give you 600 points added to your express entry points. If you get a provincial nomination that's express entry linked, I can't emphasize this enough. It's not all express entry programs. It's the express entry linked provincial nominee program that will give you 600 points. If you get that, you are basically guaranteed that you will get an invitation to apply. Okay. So how does the one in Ontario? Ontario's is called OIMP, Ontario Immigrant Nominee Program. How does Ontario's work? Well, the thing with Ontario is you cannot apply directly to them. Okay. You guys know the dating app Bumble? You know how in Bumble, you the women can contact the guys, but the guys can't contact the women directly first. Like the guys can't make the first move, the women have to make the first move. That's like this one, okay? Think of you guys as being the guys and OIMP is the women, okay? So you can't make the first move and say to OIMP, I want to apply with you. No. You go into the express entry pool. And if OIMP is interested in you to swipe right, then they're swiping right is sending you an expression of interest or a notification of interest, okay? So that's how it works. Now, how do you know, what are your chances of them swiping right on you? There are 3 categories. The first category is the human capital stream, and it's something which the government hasn't said this is exactly what we want. Okay, this is something where they have traditionally now for the last while said, okay, we want certain occupations, for example, and they have said we like people in the tech industry. There are certain tech occupations where we're going to do tech draws. Okay, but even with tech draws, they still normally specify a certain level for your CRS points. For example, we are going to invite all these people in the tech, with the specified tech occupation, software engineers, computer system manager, etc. But they have to have over 463 points, for example. Okay, there are other things with other occupations, other draws. They haven't limited themselves in this, except that in order to qualify, you have to have a bachelor's degree or higher. It doesn't have to be in Canada. It can be anywhere in the world, but you have to have a bachelor's degree. The second one is a French speaking class. If you have achieved a CLB of 7 in French and 6 in English, and you have to have a bachelor's degree. Now, last year, they were also including occupations in their draws as well. So not only do you have to achieve that level, but you also have to have had, experience in a certain occupation. We don't know if previously it was not occupation linked. We don't know in the future what they'll do. Sometimes they don't even know what they're going to do. They certainly, say, oh, well, we see who, what our needs are. We look at who's in the pool, and then we make our decisions. Okay. And the third one is the skilled trades. And that's for people who are in mostly the construction trades, and they've worked in Ontario for 1 year in the trades, okay? And then they might get invited to apply. And normally the scores for this is much lower, for the express entry score is much lower than normal. Sometimes we get people in 300s or 200s. And for yourself, or maybe you have a spouse who's working in the skilled trades, that might be an option for you guys as well. Okay. All right. So enough about express entry. Over to you, Zia, to talk about non-express entry.
Thanks. So yeah, so Ontario has streams that, like Elizabeth has talked about, that are based with express entry. Ontario also has other streams that are non-express entry, so that are specifically outside of the whole express entry system. So whether or not you qualify for express entry makes no difference for these particular streams. But the way that Ontario administers these streams is that your first step, once you're eligible, is creating a profile and going into Ontario's pool of applicants. Now, once you go into the pool, there's different, so with express entry, we talked about one pool for every single, for all the different types of programs that you could qualify for. In Ontario, their system is a little different. When you go into the pool, you're going specifically in for the stream that you qualify for. And when you're in this pool, you're given a score. The criteria that Ontario uses to create your score depends on the category that you're applying through, so the program that you're qualified under. So the way that points are allocated, the different criteria that they use are specific based on which program you're applying through. Once you're in the pool, you have your score. Again, very similarly, you're ranked in the pool based on your score. Ontario then goes in, they do a draw. If you're selected, you get an invitation. From that point, you have 14 days to prepare and submit your full application. Now, with that being said, when Ontario does draws, depending on the stream that you're applying through, the draws can be done differently. We'll talk about the streams. Let's go through the different streams and we'll talk about how that all works. So when we look at the streams that Ontario has, again, talking specifically about the non-express entry routes, the first two are the master's and PhD streams. So this is for individuals who have completed either a master's or a PhD program in Ontario. You do have to apply within 2 years of your graduation date. So we're not talking about when you completed the program, but when your degree was actually awarded to you. From then, you have 2 years to apply. Very importantly, with this program, you don't need to have any sort of job offer or work experience. Okay, so when we talk about the criteria for these programs, there's nothing about needing a particular type of job or needing a specific salary at a job or needing a particular amount of work experience. These are programs that you can apply through as soon as you've actually finished either your master's or your PhD programs. Ontario, though, requires that you're ready to actually work. So you're ready to enter the labor market. What this means is that if, let's say, for example, you finished your master's program, you're thinking about starting your PhD right away, because you're thinking of going into that PhD, or maybe you've already started your PhD, that makes you ineligible for the master's stream. So what this means is that Ontario is looking for people who are starting to work and are not pursuing any further studies currently. Okay, and again, this goes through that expression of interest system that we've just talked about.
So
the others,
sorry, so Zia, I just wanted to sort of talk about students who might want to apply through this stream, but they're thinking that they may want to leave the province. Maybe they have other opportunities, other job offers in other provinces, or maybe outside of Canada. What would you advise in those situations?
It really comes down to what your intent is at the time of your application, right? So as you're going through this process, if you're in Ontario, if your intent is to stay in Ontario, then you're qualified. If you're thinking about leaving, so let's say you've just finished your master's, you got a great offer in another province, let's say it's in British Columbia, for example, and you're thinking you're going to be taking that, you're going to be moving, then the master stream is not the right stream for you, right? Because clearly your intent is not to stay in Ontario. Right? So go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, so it really comes down to what your intent is. Now, with that being said, it doesn't mean that you're stuck in Ontario for the rest of your life. Okay. When you become a permanent resident, you have mobility rights. And so what that means is that you can move anywhere in Canada once you are a permanent resident.
Yeah, so basically with regard to the provincial nominee programs, is the provinces really, they have a quota. They can't just invite unlimited number of people. So when they have a quota, they want to make sure that they are inviting people who are going to want to stay in the province. And if you decide to go somewhere else before you get permanent residence, and these applications, they're not as fast as express entry once you're invited to apply. They can take 2 years or more to get permanent residence. So if you are going to go to somewhere else, live somewhere else, before you actually get permanent residence, then because they do track, they have, you know, called people and seeing where they are. If you do that, then your application, even if you get provincial nomination and you're at the federal stage, you could very well be rejected in that way.
Now, sorry, with that being said, though, you can be outside of Canada, right? So let's say you've finished your PhD, you've got a postdoc position in the States. You can be applying through the PhD stream, for example, while you're not physically in Canada at all, but you are still going to have to show that you have an intent to return back to Ontario with your permanent residence.
Yes, and I would argue that if you didn't have your status, if you didn't have a work permit and you are not eligible for a work permit, then that could be okay. But if you did have your work permit and you were outside of the province, even in another country, that could have been an issue, because they say, well, you're not in our province right now. You have the ability to work in our province right now, and you're not here, then we can think that your intent is not to be here. So all of this can be, you know, very important. Basically, what I would suggest that, first of all, go for a consultation. And if it is that you decide that you're probably going to want to move somewhere else, you should look at different kinds of categories. There are other categories like express entry, but they don't care. It's all about past. As long as you express entry, as long as you don't intend to live in Quebec, you're fine. Okay. These ones with the provincial nominee programs, they really, really do care that you are going to be living in Ontario. All right.
Perfect. So let's talk about some of the other non-express entry streams that Ontario has. The other 3 streams are all considered employer-based streams. So what this means is that Ontario is looking to make sure that you have a job offer, and we're looking at requirements in terms of the employer, so the company that's supporting you through your application, the position that you're being offered, and you as an applicant. Okay, so there's really 3 sets of criteria that you're thinking about when you're applying through any of the employer-based streams. In terms of employer requirements, they're the same through all of the 3 streams. So let's go through that first. The company that is supporting you needs to have been in business in Ontario for at least 3 years. Now, depending on whether they're located inside or outside of the Greater Toronto Area, there's different income and employee requirements. So for an employer that's inside of the Greater Toronto Area, they have to be able to show that they've grossed at least $1 million in their past fiscal year, and that they currently have 5 full-time employees that are either Canadian citizens or permanent residents at the time that you're applying. Those numbers decrease for a company that's outside of the GTA. So for an employer that's not in the Greater Toronto Area, their gross income requirement decreases to $500,000, and they only need to have 3 full-time employees that are Canadian citizens or permanent residents at the time that you're submitting your application. In terms of the position, the job offer does need to be full-time, and it does have to be a permanent position. So what that means is that you have a contract that's it's of an indeterminate length. There's no real end date on your employment offer or your employment contract. Let's take a look now at the 3 different criteria. So the first one I want to focus on is the international student stream. For this program, you do have to have a high-skilled job offer. And in terms of the salary requirements, the employer has to be offering you a salary that's in level with the entry-level wage for your occupation, so the occupation that they're offering you a job in the location that you're being employed. In terms of you as the applicant, you have to have finished a program here in Ontario that's either a 2-year or longer program, or you've completed a 1-year postgraduate program, And that postgraduate program needs to have as one of their entry requirements that you've completed a degree. So it can't say that you could be admitted to this program if you've completed a degree or diploma, or you've completed a degree or work experience. It's very specific in that the admission requirement for your program is that you need a degree. Okay, so either you've done a 2-year program in Ontario or a 1-year postgraduate program where a degree was a requirement. You also do need to apply within 2 years of your graduation. Okay. The second program is the skilled worker program. Here, again, you do have to have a high skilled job offer, and the median wage, the wage requirement for this is a little bit higher. It's at the median level. Really important, as the applicant, you have to show at least 2 years of work experience in the same occupation as your job offer, and that work experience has to be within the past 5 years. Now, it doesn't have to be in Ontario or in Canada even, but you do have to have at least that full 2 years of work experience, and that work experience is in that same occupation as your job offer. The last program is the in-demand occupations program. Here, Ontario has a list of occupations which qualify for this program. So the position you're being offered needs to be in one of those occupations. Okay, and you have to have at least 9 months of work experience that's based on a work permit, so legal work experience in Ontario in that occupation. It doesn't have to be with the same employer that's supporting your application, but you do have to have a total of 9 months of experience in Ontario before you're eligible to qualify. Now, with this in-demand occupations list, what we see here is that this is one of the only programs that includes low-skilled work experience. Okay, so this is really important because we don't see a lot of options for individuals with low-skilled work or a low-skilled job offer, but here Ontario does have a route for that. It can be great. I mean, again, Elizabeth's talked about using spouses and how we can position when you can apply for permanent residence. It may be that you're still studying. If your spouse is working in one of the occupations that's listed as an in-demand occupation in Ontario, you guys may be able to apply for permanent residence even earlier than when you finish your program.
Okay, so let's move on from the provincial nominee program into a final category that I want to present to you guys today. And that is a category for self-employed artists. So this category is reserved for artists who are going to provide a contribution to the cultural activities in Canada. And in order to qualify, you have to first have 2 years of work experience in the past 5 years in your art, either you're self-employed or at the world-class level. Okay, so it's if you're self-employed, you don't have to be at the world-class level, but you have to be able to support yourself. Okay, and secondly, you have to show that you will be making a significant contribution to cultural life in Canada. So you have to in this instance, it's not just the past experience, it's future as well. Normally with these kind of applications, we're really looking at a lot of letters of recommendation, your portfolio, what you have been able to, the recognition that you've had, and the fact that you are being self-employed now in Canada is very important as well, to show that you can support yourself in Canada in your art. Okay, and that's the third point. There's also a 35-point selection criteria, but if you have the above 3, then in your circumstances, you should be able to qualify for this category. Okay, so this is something that's a little bit different. With express entry, with OIMP, it's all about job offers where you're working for someone else. This is a category where if you want to work for yourself and you can support yourself in your art, then this might be a category for you. Okay, so we've talked a lot. I'm kind of tired of talking. But it may be a little bit overwhelming for you. So we wanted to go over some practical steps to keep in mind of what you should do next.
First is it's really important to have a plan, right? So knowing what your immigration goals are and how you can actually get there. These webinars are a great starting point, but as you can see, it's really just the tip of the iceberg, right? We've really gone over some of the programs at a very high level, but there's many more that you can qualify for. And so it is really important to sit down with a professional like an immigration lawyer who can actually go through your background and say, and work together to actually come up with an immigration plan that's specific to you. So keeping in mind your specific circumstances and your background, and using that to say, when are you eligible? When can you apply? And what does that process really look like for you?
And once you have your plan, then you got to execute. Okay. And sometimes, it's not easy to get through the system. So you have to have the determination and plan on doing it. For example, exams for the IELTS, right? Even if English is your first and only language, I still tell people, go and study for it. You have to at least, don't go into it cold. You have to at least know what to expect and what they expect people to do on the exams, right? Maybe your work permit, if you're only getting a 1-year postgrad work permit, maybe that's not long enough. Maybe you need to look at another study program. Don't just decide to do something without having a plan first. But once you have the plan, then the execution, be prepared that the execution may not be all that easy. Okay, but the earlier you plan, the better the execution, or the easier the execution normally.
We started talking about this right from the beginning of today's presentation. Make sure when you're here in Canada, you stay in status, that you know what the rules are in terms of keeping your status, because it is really important. As soon as you lose your status, it becomes much harder to get your status back, and then to reach those end goals if it's permanent residence, for example. And while you're here and while you're applying for any type of immigration application, make sure that you're not misrepresenting yourself in anything. It can be as simple as not even understanding a question, like, do you have a spouse? That's one that we see come up sometimes. It's really important to make sure you understand, make sure that you're answering everything correctly in your applications, because misrepresentation does carry with it a very heavy penalty. So you do want to make sure that you're not going down that route.
And just following up on this, do you have a spouse? What Zia is talking about is common law status. Okay, so just to let you guys know, common law means if you have lived with someone in a conjugal relationship for 1 year, only 1 year. Okay, so I don't care if you celebrate Valentine's Day or whatever. Make sure you mark that 1 year time, okay? Because, and I don't care if you're in love or not. Make sure you mark it, because that's status, okay? That is your family. Once the 1 year is passed, IRCC determines that you guys are family. And we see a lot of people who don't understand this or think it's not a big deal and don't declare it, and later get yourself in trouble. Okay, so make sure that you understand that 1 year mark, then your family, then your common law. Okay, and finally, if your application is rejected, hopefully you don't even get into the situation. Hopefully, you do it right from the first time and you hire a lawyer to do it. But let's say you apply and it's rejected, contact a lawyer right away. Okay, don't hesitate. Don't call the call center and ask them what to do if you can actually get through to someone, because the call center is not on your side. The call center represents the government. And even though they might be sympathetic and they're very nice and they say, oh yeah, I'll write a note, etc., it doesn't mean that your case is going to be taken care of the way it should be. Okay, first of all, if we needed to go to federal court, very strict processing timelines of 15 days only from the date of the rejection if the application is made inside Canada. Outside of Canada, 60 days. For inside Canada, where, for example, you're going to apply for your postgrad work permit, inside Canada, it's only 15 days. If you miss that deadline, you would be out of luck to go to federal court. Also, IRCC only considers one reconsideration. So if the call center tells you, oh, I'll put a note in, or you can just write a note in there. You don't really know what to write. And then they reject that. And then you come to me and you say, Elizabeth, what do I do now? Can you go and talk to IRCC? I could say, you know what? I'm sorry, you missed the federal court deadline. And IRCC is not even going to talk to me anymore because they say they already received one reconsideration. They don't look at another reconsideration, right? Timelines are super important. You may be out of time to file the restoration of status or out of time to file a postgrad work permit if you wait too long, okay? So having said all that, here's our information. If you want to book a consultation, let us know that you're coming from OCAD. We give OCAD students a student discount. And it's only $100 to book it with us, and we do Zoom calls as well, okay? Let's go through some of these questions. I think we have a few minutes left. Okay, Zia, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask you the first one.
Okay.
Yeah. So when we're talking about your self-employed work, how do you prove that? Or how do you count your hours? And then how do you prove it for permanent residence?
So that's a very good question. With regard to freelance work, oftentimes we might get a client that you might have that's a big client so that they can testify to the number of hours that you've worked for them. We might look at things like invoicing or taxes, etc. It depends on the situation. Okay, so can you explain that last semester working as a student once again?
Of course.
Yeah.
So in your final semester, you can work the same as you could during your program, and you can continue working up until you receive any sort of written confirmation from the school that you've completed your program. As soon as you receive that written confirmation, you have to stop working. From there, you can start working again once you've applied for the postgrad work permit, assuming that you have a valid study permit on the day of your postgrad work permit application. Elizabeth, can I apply for a postgrad work permit now? Right now, it's 2 months before my final term ends. Can I apply now, or do I have to wait until my semester is complete?
So in order to apply for the postgrad work permit, you need to have your final transcripts. You can only qualify for a postgrad work permit once you've completed your program and you can show the officer that you have your final transcripts where you've been a full-time student throughout all of your semesters, etc. Okay, it's also good to have a letter from the school confirming that you have completed your program as well. So I guess this person is confused. They said you can only work while you're a full-time student, except in the last semester. And then they said, you said we can work until the final grades are released. Which one is true? So
yeah.
So
here, when we talk about working, you have to be a full-time student in order to use your study permit to work. The exception to that is where you're in your final semester and you don't require a full-time course load in order to graduate, then you do not need to be a full-time student, but again, only in that final semester, and you can still work. Okay.
Yeah.
So in my final semester, can I apply? Okay, well, we've already answered part of this, but can I apply for the postgrad work permit and express entry at the same time?
Listen, you can put your profile into express entry anytime. You don't have to be in Canada. You can do it anytime. If you qualify, you can get into the pool. That doesn't mean that you're going to get out of the pool. Okay. So it's not just about entering the pool. It's about whether or not you have a reasonable chance to get your invitation to apply. Like I said, when you get into the pool, you have not applied. You're just entering yourself into the pool. Okay. Is there a financial requirement for Canadian Experience class?
No, there isn't. There's no financial requirement for Canadian Experience class.
Yeah, that's a very nice thing about Canadian Experience class. You don't have to have savings. Yeah.
The next question, Elizabeth, is once I've submitted my postgrad work permit, can I travel outside of Canada while I'm waiting for a decision on that postgrad work permit?
So this is it's a tricky one. It depends on the situation. If your study permit is still valid and you have a visa, or maybe you need an ETA, you can, once you applied for the postgrad work permit, come back, and especially if it's within the 90 days, you can do that. But if you don't have status anymore and you're on implied status, that becomes a big issue, because once you leave Canada, your implied status is over. And so let's say your study permit, you're outside of 90 days, your study permit is expired, or your study permit is expired, you don't have your work permit again. That application that you have applied inside Canada is pretty much canceled. Okay, it's supposed to be, sometimes they don't know and they keep processing it, but it's supposed to be canceled. And when you want to re-enter Canada, then if you don't have status, you could be turned away at the border, or you could experience a lot of issues. So in general, if you need to travel, try to do it after you get your postgrad work permit, or you could possibly apply for your postgrad work permit at the border as well. There are different ways that you can, do it. It just depends on some planning depending on your circumstances. So they want to know, this person wants to know, do you know your points before you apply, or is it revealed after the application is done? Again, I don't think they understand when you, sorry, go ahead, Zia.
Yeah, all I was going to say is that basically when you create your profile and you go into the pool, whether it's the express entry pool, the Ontario pool, as soon as you go into the pool, you do get your score. So you can see your score. Now, with that being said, when you're speaking with, when we go through our consultation appointments, we also do go through that in advance, because it is a very important part of the planning process and of determining what options make sense.
And again, it's not an application.
Yes.
Put yourself into the pool. It's not an application. You just get a score, but that doesn't mean that you've actually applied.
That's a very important distinction for sure.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, how long does it take to receive permanent residence from when we submit an application?
It just depends on the actual category, but it's not about when you put yourself into the pool. Okay, so express entry, you count the date from after you receive the invitation to apply and you have submitted your application. Then on average, it's supposed to take around 6 months. Sometimes we've gotten things approved in 2 months. Sometimes it's taken over a year, but normally around 6 months is their target. If you're looking at OIMP, after you've submitted, you've been invited to apply. It's all about after you get invited to apply and you submit your application. The Ontario government may take 3 months, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. But after you get your provincial nomination, you go to the federal government, that can take 1.5 to 2 years sometimes to process. So when applying for postgrad work permit, they want to apply for the open spousal work permit for their spouse. The question is, does the spouse need to be in the country?
So yeah, when you're applying for your, assuming if you're doing an extension for both of you, then yes, you would have to be in Canada when you're applying at the same time. If your spouse is not in Canada, then you'd be submitting separate applications. It is still possible to apply for them, but you would have to talk about timing and where they're applying from. Okay, the next question here So what is my legal situation if I have a contract during the period of time I'm finishing my graduate studies and applying for the postgrad work permit? If I applied for the postgrad work permit on the same day or within a week of the issuance of the transcript while having a valid work contract.
You can have a contract all you want. You just can't work. You just can't do the work until you actually are legally able to. So you are legally able to, once you've applied, you submitted your postgrad work permit. If you do it at the right time, okay? Can the person apply for TRV as a work permit while so basically they need to get a visa to travel, and they want to know if they can get a visa while waiting for a work permit to be issued.
No, so if you're applying in Canada, that TRV is based on actually having the work permit. So you can only apply for it after you've after the work permit's been approved.
Mm-hmm.
Our final question today, Elizabeth.
Yay!
Oh, 1 second.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. The final question is: I will graduate at the end of the April. When can I apply for the work permit, and how long does it take to receive the work permit?
So right now, you can look at processing times inside Canada. I think they're taking around 5-6 months to process. We do send some people to the border if they need to travel, and you can get a work permit there as well. Just depends on their circumstances. You can apply at a visa post, etc., but that won't allow you to work while you're waiting for your work permit. So in Canada right now, 5 to 6 months. Okay. All right, guys. So that's it. Thanks very much for coming. And it's always great to be here with you guys.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Sia. We really appreciate it.
Take care. No problem.
Take care,
guys.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.